Behind me is the Jamestown settlement, the first permanent English settlement in North America, founded in 1607. What we're looking at is a present day view of Jamestown, some of which has been restored, some of which consists of the original ruins. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about Jamestown and the Virginia colony that sprang from its origins in Jamestown. Let me go ahead and begin to share the screen with you. Okay. Here we go. Here are the terms. By the end of this presentation, you should understand actually 10 separate things. So it's kind of a long list. First, the major periods of American history from 1607 to 1914. We'll handle that very briefly. Second, the major themes of colonial American society. This is very important. Then the dual manpower tradition in American military history. Then we're going to move to the Gettysburg campaign, as we will frequently do during the course of the various lectures in this course. So we'll touch upon the citizen soldiers at the Battle of Gettysburg. We're going to look then at Emory Upton's critique of the dual manpower tradition. As we'll see, he was very critical of it. Next, the Elizabethan train band. Then Bacon's Rebellion, 1676 to 1677, and its impact, a major one of which was the origins of what we have come to know as white privilege. Then the use of militia in Virginia throughout this period. And then finally, the covenanted militia, so-called, in the Massachusetts Bay colony dominated by the Puritans. Here are the major periods in American history, because American military history did not occur in a vacuum, but reflected the patterns of a developing country. And here are the major periods that America passed through during the parameters of the course. And for the last of these, which you're going to see, means toward an organizational society is what it's called, will only cover the years until about 1910, although the period goes through to 1914, because by 1910, you've seen the culmination of important developments in American military policy that had been well over a century in the making. So here are the terms. First, the colonial period, which we're going to deal with extensively. Then the revolutionary period, followed by the national period, the age of expansion, westward primarily, the crisis of the Union, which begins with the toxic political culture that begins after 1848, then, of course, moves into the American Civil War, followed by the Reconstruction period, which saw additional violence, by the way, on a considerable scale, on until 1877. And then finally, as I mentioned before, an era that brought America toward an organizational society characterized by urbanization and industrialization. Now, for the next several lectures, we're going to examine the colonial period. And notice that this period lasted 156 years, over half of the overall years that we're going to be studying. And this colonial period shaped not only the contours of American history overall, but also greatly shaped the course of American military history, particularly its early reliance on militia and its outright suspicion of long-term professional soldiers. And as we're going to see, this reliance on militia, this preference for militia and citizen soldiers, and this suspicion of a regular army or professional army lasted decades after the conclusion of the colonial period. Now, for purposes of the course, we're going to focus on two key themes of the colonial period. First, the transition of the English colonies from European to American. The English settlers initially expected simply to transfer English society to North America, but found that American conditions did not permit this. Now, the English were at first disquieted by this seeming failure. Only over time did they come to see themselves as Americans and to view the differences between their society and that of England as a good thing, as a positive thing. Second thing is the changing relationship between the North American colonies and England. For decades, the English government authorized colonial ventures, but largely left them on their own, in considerable measure because the English government was preoccupied with a clash between the Crown and Parliament that culminated in a major civil war lasting between 1642 and 1649, followed by an interregnum, a period between kings, in which England tried briefly to be a republic, and then a restoration in which Parliament decided to revive the monarchy and invited Charles II, son of the executed Charles I, who had his head chopped off, invited Charles II to assume the crown in 1660. Now, James II, the brother of Charles II, took over as king upon the death of his brother Charles II and briefly tried to assert a much resented centralized control over the colonies, especially New England, but was deposed in 1688. Then the English government, called, by the way, the British government after the annexation of Scotland in 1707, resumed a policy of non-interference. This was called salutary neglect, healthful neglect, until the end of the French and Indian War, also called the 7 Years' War, in 1763. So that's a lot going on in England that caused the English government and English society, by and large, to leave the North American settlements alone. They just had a lot going on in England and didn't have time for that. Now, during the early period of colonization, we see two patterns. First, unlike the Spanish to the south in Mexico and in Central America and South America, who followed a policy of assimilating the Native Americans or the indigenous people to create a new society that was largely composed of people who combined both European and Native American heritage. These were called mestizo in Mexico. The English followed a policy similar to that practiced in Ireland, which was the earliest English colony, dating back to the early Middle Ages. And this policy involved the English settling within something called the Pale of settlement. And then the area beyond the realm of English settlement was known as beyond the Pale. That's where the expression beyond the Pale comes from. And they viewed native Irishmen, the native Irish, as a savage adversary who were, yes, nominally Christian, nominally Catholic, but really, as far as the English were concerned, only Christian by extension of the word, and unworthy of inclusion in English society. And as a corollary, when the English settled in North America, they tended to view Native Americans in much the same way they had in Ireland. They viewed Native Americans as hostile, and their policy, rather than assimilating Native Americans into English society, tended to push them beyond the area of English settlement. So that's one pattern. Now, the earliest colonies were Jamestown in Virginia, founded in 1607, and Massachusetts Bay. You have the Plymouth colony, which was founded in 1620, and then eventually absorbed into the much larger Puritan-dominated Massachusetts Bay colony, which was founded in 1628 by 700 settlers, and within 14 years was augmented by almost 10,000 additional settlers. Now, both Virginia and Massachusetts Bay faced security threats, partly from European adversaries, especially Spain, but mainly from Native Americans. So that's one pattern of colonization. The second one is that you see a consistent pattern of utopian plans, initial utopian plans, like the Puritan idea of creating a city of religion, or a settlement of religious purity, a city set on a hill, to use a biblical phrase. But the realities of life in North America frustrated those plans. So reality meant that the utopian society just wasn't going to work out, and they had to face the reality that there were significant differences between England and North America, and that these differences required adaptation. And this adaptation ultimately resulted in new forms of society. Now, a major theme throughout American military history has been the dual manpower policy. That is to say, you have a body of regular forces, like the present day active duty U.S. Army, and a body of part-time forces, such as the present day Army National Guard, which you see there. Now, many nations have a system of active duty and reserve forces. What makes the U.S. experience distinctive has been the historical tension between a political preference for a militia or citizen soldier form of military service versus active duty forces or full-time professional forces, which in the United States have been called the regular army. And not until 1903, really at the very end of this course, was this tension resolved. And by the way, many Americans fail to appreciate the large role played by the Army National Guard, Air National Guard, and reserve forces. For fiscal year 2016, for example, the active duty U.S. Army numbered 483,000 men and women. The Army National Guard numbered 348,000 men and women, with another 200,000 in the Army Reserve. So a total of 548,000 reservists, citizen soldiers, compared with 483,000 active duty regular Army forces. And thus reserve forces, all told, comprised a majority, 53%, of what was called the Army of the United States. So, and by the way, as of March 2016, the National Guard had mobilized about 780,000 citizen soldiers in total, and soldiers and airmen since the September 11th, 2001 attacks, many of whom went downrange, went to Iraq, went to Afghanistan, and served on active duty, in the same way that during the Second World War, the National Guard was mobilized on a massive scale, and entire National Guard divisions fought overseas. Now, to place this militia tradition in the context of the Gettysburg campaign, during the campaign, only a few units were true militia, hastily raised in Pennsylvania to help repel the Confederate invasion as the Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac River, moved across Maryland, and then crossed the Pennsylvania line into the state of Pennsylvania. On June 18th, the 26th Pennsylvania Emergency Militia mustered into duty with 743 officers and men. And this regiment was made up mostly of men from the central part of the state, and most of them were almost bereft of any kind of military experience. Just 8 days later, 8 days after being enlisted, um, the regiment was involved in a single skirmish against Confederate forces under Major General Jubal Early. The militia didn't stand a chance against the Confederates, who, although volunteers, were by this time, after 2 years of warfare, as battle tested as any Army regulars. Several of the emergency militia were killed or wounded, and about 100 were captured. And Confederate General Early told them, "You boys ought to be home with your mothers and not out in the fields where it is dangerous. You might get hurt." So much for the attitude of veteran Confederate troops for this emergency militia. Far more typical of the forces at Gettysburg were long-term volunteers. And these were legally militia. The laws governing these troops were militia laws. Although in the Union Army, most volunteers had enlisted for 3 years. And in the case of the Confederate volunteers, they were in effect in the ranks indefinitely, thanks to the early imposition of a military draft. At Gettysburg, the Union Army of the Potomac did have about 3,500 regular Army infantrymen out of an army that numbered between 80,000 and 95,000, depending on how you count them. And the regular Army contributed a number of artillery batteries. The battery typically consisted of 6 guns that operated, 6 cannon that operated in unison. But the rest of the Union Army and the Confederate Army were volunteers. And what we're looking at here is a monument on the Gettysburg battlefield to the 121st New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment, which was raised in central New York. And its soldiers enlisted for 3 years. The regiment was mustered into service on August 23rd, 1862. Within a month of its enlistment, the regiment was in combat at the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day of the entire Civil War. In fact, the bloodiest single day in all of American military history. And by the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, it had fought the Battle of Fredericksburg and the Battle of Chancellorsville. Ultimately, this regiment would take part in 25 military engagements. And its total enrollment during its time of service, including replacements for those who'd been killed and wounded or who had died from disease, total enrollment was 1,897, of whom 14 officers and 212 enlisted men were killed or mortally wounded. Then 4 officers and 17 enlisted men died of disease or other causes. And this total of 126 men killed represented 11.9% of its entire membership. And its total of 839 killed and wounded was one of the largest sustained by any regiment. At the time of the Gettysburg campaign, the colonel of the 141st New York Regiment was 24-year-old Colonel Emory Upton, an 1861 graduate of the U.S. Military Academy. We know it more commonly as West Point. And Upton drilled his troops to such a high standard that they became known as Upton's regulars. In other words, they were as good as regular long-term professional forces. Now, we're going to encounter Upton, again, down the line. Even during the Civil War, he was a fierce critic of the militia, or the volunteers, as the nation's chief reliance um, for military defense, arguing that the amateur tradition was needlessly costly in lives and made the Civil War a 4-year military stalemate that was unnecessary. After the war, he systematized his critique, arguing that the United States should rely mainly on long-term professional soldiers, what was commonly called the regular army. In 1880, he published The Military Policy of the United States, which you see there, which was a lengthy indictment of the militia tradition, showing how time and again the militia had proven inadequate on battlefields ranging from the War for American Independence to the Civil War. And I used published by extension of the word because, strictly speaking, it would not be published until 1904. But his manuscript circulated widely among post-Civil War military reformers and influenced their ideas and advocacy for new policies. But Upton failed to appreciate how deeply entrenched the militia system was in the United States and had been so since colonial times. And here I'm going to stop, give you a little bit of a break, and then we'll move on there.